Hello, I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun, and joining me is Dan Fumano, our City Hall columnist. Good morning, Dan.
Morning, Harold.
First week, I guess, full week of council, back at it in January. And I know you've already had a look at the Mayor's Budget Task Force report and written about it. What are sort of the Cole's notes on that document?
Yeah, so that is going to be coming to council tomorrow, which is Tuesday, January 23rd. You'll recall that sort of shortly after the ABC Majority Council approved their first annual operating budget early in 2023. That was funded by the biggest property tax hike we've seen in Vancouver in recent memory, the 10.7% property tax hike. The mayor came out and said it was necessary, but they were going to try to make sure that that didn't become the new normal going forward, these big year-over-year tax hikes. So shortly after that, that's when the mayor had a press conference and announced that he had formed this panel of outside experts, accountants, and other kinds of experts to look at the city finances and try to find efficiencies, places where they could save money without compromising service, or also places where they could maybe raise more revenue. And so initially, their mandate, this task force mandate, was that they were supposed to present to council with their recommendations in early October of last year so that council could consider the recommendations for the 2024 budget cycle. That didn't work out. The task force members said they underestimated how complex and difficult this was going to be. So the timing was a bit different. So it's basically just being presented to council this week, too late to affect the 2024 budget, but it could potentially be stuff that they take into consideration for the 2025 budget and potentially beyond that.
Right.
So
it could be their final 2 years in office before the next election.
yes, yeah, exactly. So the report itself from this task force includes a lot of stuff that people who do follow these municipal budget things closely would have heard a lot of this stuff over the years. So people who have been on council before, people who watch council, would have heard a lot of these kinds of things, like about how the city has this massive and kind of worrying infrastructure deficit. There's all this very expensive sewer infrastructure under the ground that most people don't think about on a day-to-day basis, but it's very expensive, needs to be upgraded. And then it kind of just outlines a lot of the financial pressures on the city, many of which are because the city is increasingly trying to step into areas that were traditionally the responsibility of senior governments, provincial and federal governments. And then the city is having to spend more and more of its resources trying to deal with some of these issues. So the report is kind of talking about that stuff. Again, those are not new ideas for people who've watched these municipal budget processes fold out year after year. But of course, a lot of people, even if they are property taxpayers, maybe don't pay super close attention to the details of the municipal. They wouldn't be watching the municipal budget meetings, for example. It's only a handful of people who actually see this stuff. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of questions council have. Council are not going to be making any decisions this week one way or the other. This is just a matter of they're going to receive this stuff for information. So they'll have a presentation. I think they'll get a chance to ask some questions, but it's not like they're voting on anything or making any decisions this week.
Okay. I'm sure there'll be some questions about a section of the report that talks about the potential to sell non-core city-owned assets as a way to, I guess, either reduce costs or earn revenue, or maybe a little bit of both. But I know you pressed the councillor on the committee for some examples of non-core assets, and he was not willing to offer up any.
No, I mean, he was not willing to sort of give any specifics or even give a general sense of what types of assets would we be talking about here. The most he would say is, well, because the document itself does not define what non-core assets might be.
Right.
It does define core assets as being, assets that are critical to the city's core mandate and long-term strategies, including essential infrastructure such as roads, water, and sewer systems, parks, and emergency services facilities. So, parks are clearly listed in there as core assets. And, the Councillor Montague, who's a member of, he's on council with the ABC majority, and he was also part of the advisory panel for this task force. So he's kind of one of council's representatives that was involved with the task force. What he did say to me is, well, if something's not listed under core assets, then you can infer that those things would be non-core assets. So I said to him, well, then, so we're talking about community centers, civic theaters, recreation facilities, potentially.
Libraries.
Libraries would be a big, yeah, exactly. So, and, you know, he didn't get into specific. He did say he thinks that it's a conversation that the city needs to have, because he thinks there are assets out there where divestment or selling them, I guess, essentially, like, no longer, you know, owning these assets might be the city's best option going forward, but he would not provide any kind of indication of what type of assets he might be talking about there. So
how often does that happen? Does the city ever sell assets?
It has. There have been times where the city has divested assets. I mean, I'm just thinking of one relatively, it wasn't a huge example in, you know, in terms of the city's inventory of assets, but there was a small parking lot in Marpole that the city transferred over to the Musqueam First Nation a number of years ago, basically as a gesture of, I think, of goodwill and reconciliation for just a nominal fee. It wasn't like market, and it was in connection with the city had owned this surface parking lot, and it was shortly after this major archaeological discovery of a midden, the Marpole midden nearby. And so, I mean, that's just kind of one relatively. So the city also, in some cases, will, you know, transfer the ownership of like a laneway or something, because the city, you know, owns the streets and laneways. City sometimes will transfer ownership of a laneway or something, maybe as part of a major real estate development if a developer is going to build a whole bunch of stuff, and then they can
as
use
far
that
as
in
selling
negotiations.
off a library or a community center or something like that,
I can't think of a time where the city has sold off an asset like that. The city does enter into, the city is a landlord, right? So enters into different kinds of partnerships with private sector businesses who lease space from the city to operate all kinds of businesses. But as far as the city selling off assets, now, of course, there are other examples of other levels of other levels of government selling off assets. The BC government over the years sold a lot of real estate, a lot of pieces of land to developers, or other kinds of interests, former healthcare sites, public housing sites that were sold to the private sector to generate money for the public sector. But those kinds of sales have also been controversial, with critics saying that, you know, it's a short-term gain to get this money, but then you lose the land in the long term.
Right. Well, I guess, and on the other side of the coin, there are cases where the city actually rents space from the private sector.
Yeah.
So I guess you could potentially see a scenario, I'm not saying this would happen, but where the city might sell an asset and then lease space back.
Right.
Whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
Okay. And another issue that I'm sure will generate some discussion, and you talked about in your recent story, is around naming rights on city-owned facilities. That's another recommendation from the task force?
Yeah, there is a recommendation there to explore sort of naming rights or sponsorships, you know, working with the private sector. You know, as I understand it, the way I read it, it seems kind of not unlike how, you know, a new wing of a hospital might be funded by a wealthy, you know, philanthropist or a major corporation. You know, obviously we have, you know, different schools at universities will sometimes have the names of wealthy benefactors on the name, on the school or the library or whatever. And so I guess it's sort of saying, you know, looking at, are there opportunities for the city maybe to partner with, whether it's private philanthropists or foundations or potentially corporations who might be interested in spending money for naming rights.
Right. Do they go so far as to try to estimate the kinds of revenue this could generate? You know, because it's one question to say, well, let's do it, but would it make a discernible dent in the overall budget of the city?
No, I don't see any, I didn't see any figures in there for how much money could be raised by naming rights. Okay. But I mean, it's, yeah, but it would be an interesting, you know, debate to see.
Councillor Carr said she was uncomfortable with naming rights. Did she explain why?
It sounds like just sort of a philosophical kind of objection that if, it's the public realm, if it's public assets like a community center or a park or whatever, that she's not comfortable with private interests kind of staking, putting their stamp on these public assets. Councillor Boyle, sorry?
Because why? Because why though? Sorry, why?
She doesn't like the idea. She thinks the public realm should be public and free of private advertising, essentially. That it sounds like a philosophical kind of objection. Councillor Boyle, who's one of the other three councillors not affiliated with ABC, she said, she can't say at this stage whether she's fully in favor of or against the idea. She would want to look at specifics, but she said she's not necessarily opposed to it out of hand, with a bunch of caveats, as long as the donations or as long as the money is not coming with strings attached. For example, there could be worries that if donations are coming to benefit amenities in certain parts of the city where wealthier Vancouverites happen to live, at the expense of being able to upgrade facilities or whatever in places with a more working class population, or if there were strings attached that came with the money around how different public facilities handle their priorities or change their purpose or mandate, she would just want to make sure that there were no strings attached, but she wasn't rejecting the idea out of hand, but she had some concerns that she'd want to look at on a case-by-case basis.
Are there any examples right now in the city?
Well, as I say, of course, there's lots of hospitals and universities and things like that.
I mean, in terms of city-owned.
So in terms of city-owned assets, I mean, the one thing that came to my mind is Nat Bailey Stadium, where the Vancouver Canadians play baseball. That's a city owner. I think the park board owns that park, but the field itself is everyone knows it as Nat Bailey Stadium or the Nat, but the field itself is technically, I believe it's Rogers Field at Nat Bailey Stadium.
Oh,
and
interesting.
I don't actually know exactly how that sponsorship arrangement works, or who basically, I don't know how that works exactly, but that is an example of, obviously there's a partnership there between the private entity that owns the Canadians baseball club, the park board that owns the field, and I'm not sure exactly how that, but previous, I think Scotiabank was the naming partner.
Yes.
But
yes. Oh, interesting.
But I'm not sure exactly how that arrangement works. But that was just the first one that came to mind for me, where I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that'll be interesting. Let's see where the conversation leads us, and what happens next with this report. All right. Have a great week at council, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Harold. Thank you.